This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 148 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. So Blackstone Laboratories, we're not the only oil analysis lab in the game, but there are elements to our approach that do set Blackstone apart. This episode is all about averages and the role they play in our report and how they are a helpful baseline to tell you what is going on with your engine and to help inform your understanding of what we might point out as normal, abnormal, or somewhere in between. It all started with a sample from a 6.6 liter Duramax that I looked at, and I wrote up the report noting that levels of copper and lead were high compared to what we see on average from that engine type. Lead especially. It was the dominant metal in that sample, and if you know anything about the way engines are designed, you wouldn't want most of the metal to be made at the bearings. So I let the customer know it looked like a potential bearing problem was in the works, as this is far more metal than we typically see on average for a diesel of this type. Looked into possible explanations for the excess wear in question, and sent off the report. As it turns out, the customer called before I was gone for the day, and I took a look at the report again, breaking down the results I reported and just giving them a little bit more detail about how we arrived at the conclusions we did. The customer was a little surprised because this isn't the first sample that they've taken from the engine, but it is the first one that they've sent to Blackstone. They sent along a PDF attachment of another oil analysis report they had received from a different lab that I wasn't familiar with. Looking at the report, though, they did perform some of the same testing we do. Now, since I'm not familiar with their methodology or how they arrive at the results in the exact way that we do, I can't really speak to their results in great detail. However, it does look like they ran a spectral analysis based on some of the elements present on this report, and the levels did match up fairly similarly with the levels that we saw. But the key difference is that while we identified levels that were unusual for the engine type, this particular lab noted that the analysis showed a proper performance both of the lubricant and the system it was taking care of. Now, the customer was confused, as I was, about how they arrived at these conclusions. What are the standards for comparison? Are they comparing to diesels in general, this particular engine model? It's hard to say. I couldn't find anything on the report or on the website that would help explain why the levels are normal to them. But here at Blackstone, we have averages that are dedicated not just to diesels and not just to engines in general, but to the model being sampled, with a couple of key exceptions. We do not include wear-in samples, and we do not include samples from engines that have a known problem, and here's why. During wear-in, you're going to see a lot of metal and silicon, but that's normal. That's due to internal parts settling in, as well as silicone-based sealers used for assembly. You might even get a high potassium level early on in a diesel just from harmless flux material washing out. So we don't want to include those, and we don't want to include samples from engines that have an obvious problem. Think about contamination and excess metal going together. We don't want to skew averages with a sample like that because it would make it seem like that engine type normally makes more metal than it really would. So instead, we look to include all the samples that do not come from engines where there is an obvious problem or where it's breaking in. That way, you have an idea of what that engine is typically going to look like in testing when it's going about its business and doing the operation it is designed for. And if that's not enough, we also take averages a step further and provide an average file specific to you. So that way you can see universal averages based on all the other samples from that engine type we have seen. Again, excluding samples from engines with known problems or break-in samples, as I mentioned already. We then want to build averages that are based just on your samples and your samples alone. Because not every driver is going to treat their engine exactly the same. You have your workload and someone else has theirs. You have the terrain that you typically operate on, someone else has theirs. Maybe you're more careful with your oil changes, you don't run the oil as long, or maybe you operate in conditions where you expect certain results, like a high amount of silicon from dusty conditions, for example. The point is, you have your averages because we understand that your operation can be unique to you and what you ask of your motor. But we want to start you off with a comparison to universal averages just so you can get an idea of what most samples we see from that engine tend to look like. And of course, the averages aren't just for you, they're for us as well. They work as a guide for us to determine early on what a typical layout of metal content is for that motor and its design. That way we can spot abnormalities, like lead being the dominant metal, when we know that it usually isn't, not just for most engines, but for a 6.6 liter Duramax. From there, we can highlight metals that look like a potential concern, and then go a step further and tell you why it appears they are high. If you don't have contamination, if the oil appears to be holding up well, and you don't have excess solids that would say that your oil filter was used up or struggling, well, then we can start to build a trend and see if A, your engine tends to wear differently than average, or B, it appears that a problem is brewing. And that's why I always say averages are important. They're a starting point for comparison, but they are not the be-all, end-all. They're step one. And then we want to go to step two, which is building trends. Unfortunately, in some cases, a problem looks like a problem even without trends. And this is an engine that we definitely want to keep a close eye on because there's just no likely reason for there being this much copper and this much lead other than the engine simply wearing heavily at the bearings. So it's an engine to keep a close eye on. And that's because we know what to expect from that model in general, especially with an average file that's as developed as the 6.6 liter Duramax. Thousands and thousands of samples are in that average file. And you can expect the same from a lot of other known manufacturers that have been around a long time, be it Cummins or Ford, GM. If it's a manufacturer that you've heard of, chances are we have too. And that means the average file that we put in place is going to be based on, in most cases, a reliable baseline comprised of, in some cases, over 10,000 samples. It wouldn't be surprising to have. So when you send in a sample, provided that you include the details of what exactly it's from, you can anticipate a comparison to exactly that model to get the ball rolling. The only time we're going to use generic averages for comparison is when we don't know what specific model it is that you're sampling. And better still, you can inform us down the road if for some reason the details are lost along the way. If you send in a blank slip or if you forget to include certain details, we can update your report as needed and include a more detailed reference for comparison so that way you have a report that's the most helpful to you. And there you have it. If the levels are indeed marked as high on your report from Blackstone Laboratories, you know exactly the methodology behind it. An analyst looking at the sample, comparing to samples from that specific engine model, not just diesels or gasoline engines in general. Unless, of course, we don't have the information, we are going to dial in a comparison to the model that is being sampled. Then we'll note if the levels appear abnormal, normal, or if they're that special in between, slightly elevated maybe, but not to the point we suspect a problem. Whatever the case may be, you know that we're comparing to what it is that you're sampling. And that way, you know the reference for what is indeed high, normal, low, whatever the case may be. Not only are we comparing to that particular model, we're also basing the comparison on the miles or the hours relative to averages as well. There's going to be an oil change interval that those averages are based on as well. So if you send in a sample with 10,000 miles on it, averages are based on 7,000 miles. We are taking into account how the metals compare, not just at face value, but on a per mile basis too. We want to understand how your engine is wearing on a per hour or a per mile basis, whatever interval is most useful to you compared to that average file as well. Understanding how much metal is being made per mile or per hour can also greatly inform whether or not there is a problem brewing. So you can bank on us taking into account not just what is being sampled, but how long you've been running the oil in that particular system, because that also goes a long way in determining whether or not metals are problematic. One thing we don't compare to averages all that much, though, would be the additive elements in the oil that you're sampling. So if you see a magnesium level or a calcium level that's sky high relative to averages, or in some cases very low, it all depends on the recipe, we don't typically mark those in bold because those don't speak to how your engine is wearing. Those are specific to the brand or blend being sampled. And one manufacturer's recipe varying from another doesn't speak to a problem in your engine. So we're sitting down looking at the wear metals compared to averages, then looking at the markers for contamination independent of averages, because we understand that potassium, sodium, these elements can show coolant regardless of what's average. It's more so about the actual amounts. Same with silicon, an element that can show dirt if it's not from sealer or lube. Anytime you go over a report and you see levels that are marked in bold, there's going to be a reason why, and we explain that reason in the comment. Sometimes it's because the levels are abnormal compared to averages. Sometimes it's because they're in an unusual balance compared to averages. But rest assured, that far right column on the report page, while it may be universal in name, it is specific to that engine type being sampled. And as you continue to send those samples in, you'll have averages for your engine too. Because we understand it's not just the data that we've obtained from other engines, but yours as well, that makes the difference in understanding how that engine is doing. That brings today's show to a close. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.